Hello everyone. So today we're here to continue our project with Codeigniter 4. Our project will be done with this framework, as you know, but before we dive into the actual coding, I think it's important to tell you on how the framework works, what concepts are behind it, and how things can actually be done in the framework. This is something that is very important and that everyone should do before starting to code. The first thing you need to know is that Codeigniter is a framework that is based on the MVC concept. If you're not familiar with the MVC concept, if you go into the documentation, you can see here on how the MVC actually works. Models normally manage the data of the application and help enforce any special business rules. Views are simple files. They'll normally don't have any business logic. They have little logic to them. They just serve as an output of data. And controllers act as a glue of code marshmallowing. So they talk to the models, they get data from the models, they'll send data to and from the models and send the result to the views, so then the views can display the data. This can be seen on a graph like this. I took them from this site, but this looks like a good example of how the MVC concept works. So the user sees the view, user has an action, that action gets sent to the controller. The controller, if necessary, goes into the model, updates or gets something, the model notifies the controller with the data, and then the data gets sent to the viewer with some sort of output. So let's dive into the application structure. The application structure, there's a bunch of folders here, but the base folders are the app folder, the public folder, the system folder, and the writable folder. The public folder, this is the folder where your virtual host or your server or whatever should point to. So this is actually the only public thing that is going to the outside world, and this is the only file that should be the only PHP file that should be visible to the outside world. In this folder, if you have any assets like CSS, JavaScript, or whatever, they should go into the public folder as well. The system folder, you shouldn't mess about in anything here. Like, this is the base of your framework. You shouldn't change anything here. If you want to change the behavior of some of the classes or libraries or whatever, you should do it by extending the system libraries, never changing the system libraries directly, because if you need to upgrade the framework in the future, you have a lot of problems doing that. Then there's the writable folder. The writable folder is basically where everything gets written during the application lifecycle. This is where the cache goes to, the debugger output goes to, your logs, your session files. In case you're using session files as a driver, you can use database or other systems. And there's your uploads folder as well. But once you go into the app folder, this is where the actual MVC thing comes up. So you have your main folders. They are the controllers, the views, and the models. So if you go into the controllers, you have just two files by default. One is your home controller. This is the one that is being called on the base site of the framework. And then there's the base controller, where this one serves as construct mechanism to your controller, so they will extend the base controller. So if you want something that will be auto-loaded, or if you want something that will be used across the application, you can just extend your controllers to your base controller. You can have more than one base controller, you can have as many as you want. So let's say if you have like one part of the application that is completely different to the other part of the application, you might want to have two base controllers separate for each part of the application. Then you have your models folder. The models are where your business logic will be, most of it. This is where you interact with your database. This is where your query builder will work. So bear in mind, this is where you work most of the time. And then this is your views folder. So basically this is your HTML, your output. This could have variables that are sent to it and then displayed to the user. So your config folder. Your config folder is basically where all your configuration files will be stored. Both the application config files, the ones that come already with the framework, but if for some reason you need to create another config file for a specific action on your framework and your application, they will be stored here as well. Config files are normally classes. They are just classes that have properties to them, and then you can just access these properties when you call the config. So your app.php will have your base config, like your base URL, your index file, stuff like that. Your autoload.php, this is where you'll put your class maps and your PSR4 class maps, your namespaces, stuff like that. Then you have your cache folder, your constants. There's a bunch of constants already created, but if you need to add more constants to your application, you can do that here. So this one is obviously not a class, because it's just variables defined as constants. Then you have, for instance, your database.php, where you'll set up your connection to your database. This is your default connection. This is your connection for running unit tests. Once again, these configs should be your production configs. For development, you should use your environment file and write those here. Then you have your email, your encryption, your events, exceptions, filters, format, honeypot, image, kill, logger, migrations. You get the gist. Like everything that is configured in the application should be accessed here and should live here. The one that you probably need the most here would be the routes. So every time a user makes a request on your application, the routing system will try to figure out where to send the request, to what controller should receive the request. But the normal behavior is, like, for instance, here I have the default. My default route is home index. This means if I don't have anything on my application defined as a routing there, the home index controller should be loaded by default. So home, class home, and the index function should be called. But let's say if I want to access that, here should be just the same. So if I do home index, this works just the same. But this, you have to have a default controller, otherwise the application don't know where to go. Then you have your migrations, your seeds, if you want to use that, your filters. Filters are basically when you want to run some piece of code before or after a function, controller function is called. So if you go into the filters documentation, controller filters, you have a before filter and an after filter. So if you create a before filter, will always be an instance in the request interface. And let's say, for instance, if you want to protect some controllers with some kind of authentication system. So instead of going into all those controllers and just put a piece of code that will detect if the user is logged in or not, you can just create a filter and then say that this filter should run on all the controllers that I specify, and then you can do the check for the authentication there. And this will work with your filters that are defined in your config folder. So right here, so you define here your before. These are the globals, but you can create your own right here, defining where they're gonna run and how, if they are before or after, depending on the class that you created. Then you have your helpers. Helpers are normally just functions that you can call at any time if you have the helper loaded. Then you have your language files. They should live in your language folder. Then you have your libraries. A library is just a simple class that you can create and then call and use whatever you want for whatever the purpose the library has. You can use libraries that are loaded via Composer, and those will live in the vendor folder if you have Composer on your project. But if you have a library that you create yourself for the purpose of your project, you can just leave it there. Then the models, we already talked about them. Then the third party. The third party is, let me just show you again, overview, application structure, third party libraries that can be used in the application. I don't really see the use of this folder actually, because these are just libraries that can also live in the libraries folder, so I don't see the point of that. And then there's the view folders that we already talked about. So this is the basic structure of Codeigniter, and this is something that you should bear in mind before using any framework. Before using any framework, you should go and take a look at the structure, read about the folders and what each folder does, so you can actually put your files in the correct place so that everything works as expected. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This is more of a explaining thing and not coding, but on the next video we'll start to code for a little bit and start to play with things and create the controllers and stuff like that. But today I actually think that it was important to show you this. So if you're enjoying the series, please consider subscribing and drop a like down below if you want, and I see you on the next one.